December 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The cold is not just a condition, it is a presence. It bites through wool, canvas, and skin, turning breath into white smoke and fingers into stiff tools that barely obey the brain. Snow absorbs sound, muting explosions into dull thuds that feel closer than they are. Somewhere beyond the frozen tree line, German artillery adjusts its aim. From a ridgeline outside the town, a German infantry officer raises his binoculars and stares into the haze. What he expects to see is movement, retreat, disorder, the familiar signs of an American unit pulling back under pressure. That is what usually happens when supply lines are cut and armor support disappears. But Bastogne offers no such comfort. Instead, the Americans are still there. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no clear escape route. Yet the defensive line does not collapse. These are not the methodical British formations the Germans have studied since North Africa, advancing behind carefully timed barrages, nor are they standard US infantry units that rely heavily on logistics, rotation, and overwhelming firepower. The men dug into the frozen earth around Bastogne wear a small eagle patch on their shoulder, screaming, wings spread. The 101st Airborne Division. Paratroopers. Light infantry, supposedly vulnerable without supply. And yet, they are holding. To understand why Bastogne became a psychological breaking point for German veterans, you have to strip away the arrows on the map and zoom in. War at this distance is not strategy. It is young men in foxholes, surrounded, listening to enemy boots crunch in the snow. Most of the soldiers defending Bastogne are in their early 20s. Many have been in combat for less than 6 months. Some were resting behind the lines only days earlier when the German offensive exploded through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge begins not with preparation, but with shock. On December 16, 1944, German forces launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, exploiting poor weather and thin Allied lines. The goal is ambitious and desperate: split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. For the Americans, the first days are chaos. Units are overrun, roads clog with refugees, retreating soldiers, and shattered columns. Commanders scramble to understand where the front even is. In the middle of that confusion lies Bastogne. 7 roads converge there. Whoever controls the town controls movement across a wide sector of the Ardennes. The Germans know this, so do the Americans. When the order comes down, the 101st Airborne is rushed by truck toward the sound of the guns, arriving with little preparation and almost no winter gear. Some men wrap newspapers around their feet, others stuff straw into their jackets. They dig in anyway. German intelligence initially categorizes the defenders as temporary obstacles. Paratroopers are elite, yes, but elite units break too when surrounded long enough. Ammunition runs low, food disappears, medical supplies become precious. Wounded men refuse evacuation because evacuation no longer exists. Still, the perimeter holds. Inside Bastogne, the war takes on a claustrophobic rhythm. German patrols probe the lines at night, testing for weakness. American foxholes answer with disciplined fire. When a section bends, another fills the gap. Officers are killed. Non-commissioned officers take over. When they fall, privates step forward. There is no dramatic speech, no rallying cry, just a stubborn refusal to give ground. From the German side, this is unsettling. These are not Americans fighting with abundance. They are fighting with absence. No tanks rolling in to save them, no sky full of Allied aircraft. The weather grounds air support. The roads are cut. And yet the resistance feels organized, deliberate, almost defiant. German after-action reports begin to describe the defenders not as a broken pocket, but as a fortress made of frozen foxholes and exhausted men.
For the soldiers of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne is not yet legend. It is hunger, it is frostbite, it is watching the sky and hoping for clear weather. It is counting bullets and deciding which targets matter most. It is holding a rifle so cold it burns the skin. And slowly, without ceremony, something shifts. The Germans are still attacking, but now with caution. Recon units hesitate. Assaults probe instead of surge. The expectation of collapse fades. In its place grows a different understanding. This enemy will not fold easily. Not because they are stronger, not because they are better equipped, but because in this frozen ring around Bastogne, retreat has ceased to be an option they consider. This is the moment Bastogne stops being a tactical objective and becomes something else entirely. A test of will. And for German veterans who had faced British discipline and American firepower before, the men of the 101st Airborne introduce a new dangerous variable, an American infantry that fights like it has nothing left to lose. And the battle has only just begun.
By December 18, the word surrounded stops being theoretical. German units complete the encirclement around Bastogne with methodical efficiency. Roads are cut one by one, bridges are watched, fields are covered by overlapping fire. What remains inside the perimeter is a pocket of resistance, disorganized on paper but stubbornly alive on the ground. For German commanders, this is not unusual. Encirclements are supposed to suffocate. Time does the work. Hunger, cold, and fear finish what artillery begins. But Bastogne does not behave like a pocket that knows it is doomed. Inside the American lines, the situation deteriorates fast. Rations shrink to a single meal a day, sometimes less. Ammunition is conserved obsessively. Medics reuse bandages. Morphine is rationed. The wounded lie in cellars and makeshift aid stations, wrapped in blankets that smell of damp stone and blood. Frostbite cases increase daily. Some soldiers cannot feel their feet anymore. Others cannot feel their hands and still hold their rifles. What surprises German observers is not that the Americans are suffering, it is that the suffering does not translate into collapse. At night, German patrols crawl close to the American lines, expecting to hear panic, movement, disorder, the telltale noise of men preparing to flee. Instead, they encounter discipline. Trip flares snap on, machine guns open in short, controlled bursts, mortars answer within seconds. The perimeter breathes, bends, but does not break. For German infantrymen who had fought Americans earlier in the war, this feels different. In Normandy, American strength came with mass, tanks, artillery, air power. Even when U.S. infantry held ground, there was always the sense that overwhelming force would soon follow. Bastogne strips that assumption away. There are no reinforcements coming, at least none that anyone inside the pocket can see. And yet, the defense grows sharper. Officers move constantly along the lines, checking positions, correcting fields of fire, encouraging men who can barely stand upright from exhaustion. Non-commissioned officers become anchors. When communications fail, runners move through shell fire to relay orders. The chain of command shortens, becomes personal. Decisions are made face to face, often under fire. On December 22nd, the Germans decide to test the Americans psychologically. A small delegation approaches under a white flag. They carry a typed message addressed to the American commander, demanding surrender. The tone is formal, confident. It outlines the hopelessness of the situation and promises honorable treatment if resistance ceases. Inside Bastogne, the paper circulates quickly. The response, written hastily and delivered back through the snow, is short, almost dismissive. For German officers accustomed to surrender negotiations dragging on, this answer is shocking in its simplicity. It does not argue strategy. It does not plead circumstance. It does not acknowledge desperation. It refuses the premise entirely.
From that moment, Bastogne stops being just a military problem and becomes a matter of pride on both sides. German artillery increases its tempo. Shells walk across American positions, tearing through trees, collapsing foxholes, shredding frozen earth. Infantry assaults follow, probing for weak points. Each attack expects to find the Americans thinner, slower, more hesitant than before. Instead, the resistance stiffens. Small unit actions define the days that follow. A platoon holds a crossroads longer than expected. A machine gun crew stays in position after losing half its men. A paratrooper with frostbite hands refuses evacuation because he can still pull a trigger. None of this is dramatic in the moment. There are no speeches, only quiet decisions repeated thousands of times. For German veterans, this behavior is unsettling. They understand elite troops, they respect British discipline and Soviet resilience, but what they see at Bastogne is an American unit that has shed the stereotype of abundance. These men are not fighting because they expect rescue any moment. They are fighting because the idea of leaving has simply disappeared from their mental map. Encirclement is supposed to induce calculation. At Bastogne, it produces defiance. The weather deepens the isolation. Thick clouds lock the sky shut. No Allied aircraft appear. The sound of engines never comes. German troops begin to assume that relief will not arrive in time. From a purely tactical standpoint, the situation should favor the attackers, yet reports from the front start to reflect something else. Assault units describe defenders who counterattack immediately after bombardment. Recon elements report that American positions are reoccupied minutes after being shelled. Prisoners taken during skirmishes speak not of surrender plans, but of holding until someone gets through. That phrase appears again and again, until someone gets through. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne is no longer about the Ardennes offensive or the fate of Antwerp. It is about the foxhole they occupy, the man next to them, and the line that must not move. Every hour survived becomes proof, to themselves more than to anyone else, that they are still in control of something. And for the Germans watching from the tree line, something becomes clear. These Americans are not holding because they are ordered, they are holding because they have decided to. And that decision makes Bastogne far more dangerous than any strong point marked on a map. Because an enemy who believes collapse is inevitable can be pressured into it, but an enemy who has stopped imagining defeat becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability in winter warfare is deadly.
For German commanders who had spent years studying Allied behavior, one belief remained deeply rooted. Americans fight best when supported by overwhelming systems: air power, artillery, armor, logistics. Remove those pillars and the structure weakens. Bastogne dismantles that assumption. By the third week of December, German units surrounding the town expect to see the familiar signs of degradation: slower reaction times, gaps between positions, increased surrender at the edges of the perimeter. These are patterns German veterans have seen repeatedly on other fronts. They do not appear. Instead, the American defense begins to show an uncomfortable maturity. Small units adapt their positions nightly, shifting foxholes to avoid pre-registered artillery. Fields of fire are adjusted with obsessive care. Ammunition is redistributed from sectors under less pressure to those absorbing the heaviest attacks. Even in shortages, the system holds together, not through abundance, but through discipline. This is not how American infantry is supposed to fight. The men defending Bastogne are not rotating out. There is no relief in sight. Yet fatigue does not translate into passivity. Patrols continue to operate beyond the perimeter, harassing German positions, capturing prisoners, disrupting preparations. Every night spent outside the wire reinforces the same message: the defenders are not content to wait. German veterans take note.
This behavior resembles something they associate more closely with long-season Eastern Front combat, units hardened by attrition, accustomed to improvisation. But here, the accents are American, the uniforms are American, the stubbornness is unexpected. Inside Bastogne, command cohesion becomes the invisible weapon. When officers fall, sergeants step forward without hesitation. When communications collapse, junior leaders act on intent rather than orders. The result is a defense that feels decentralized but purposeful, harder to disrupt with artillery or shock assaults. German intelligence officers begin to revise their assessments. These are not green troops clinging to a town out of desperation. These are airborne infantrymen operating as if the encirclement has stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essentials: position, weapon, responsibility. The cold accelerates this transformation. Temperatures drop well below freezing. Weapons malfunction. Metal snaps skin. Wounds that might be survivable in warmer conditions become lethal. The physical cost is enormous, and yet discipline persists. Sentries remain alert, relief schedules are enforced, men sleep in short, controlled intervals, fully aware that lapses mean death. For German soldiers probing the perimeter, this discipline is visible. They encounter positions that are never truly abandoned. Foxholes that appear empty at first light erupt with fire minutes later. Defensive depth reveals itself only when attacks stall, not before. It becomes difficult to identify weak sectors because weakness is temporary and rapidly corrected. The Americans are no longer behaving like a force waiting for rescue. They are behaving like a force that intends to survive regardless of rescue. This shift creates a psychological problem for the attackers. Encirclement warfare depends on pressure producing inevitability. Bastogne resists that logic. Every failed probe costs German units time, ammunition, and morale, resources they cannot spare. The longer the pocket holds, the more it becomes a magnet for Allied counteraction, and the Germans know it. Yet breaking it proves harder than expected. The most unsettling element for German veterans is not the Americans' firepower, it is their refusal to display panic. Even under bombardment, even when foxholes collapse and positions are briefly overrun, the defenders counterattack immediately. There is no pause long enough for the attackers to consolidate gains. From a distance, this behavior looks reckless. Up close, it is calculated. The Americans understand that yielding space invites exploitation. Holding ground, even briefly, denies momentum. This understanding, applied instinctively by junior leaders, frustrates every attempt to create a cascading failure. The stereotype of the American soldier begins to fracture. These are not troops dependent on systems alone. These are soldiers capable of operating when systems fail, precisely the condition encirclement is supposed to create. For German veterans who have spent years fighting opponents either rigid or chaotic, this hybrid resistance is difficult to read. Bastogne teaches them something uncomfortable. American infantry, when stripped down to its core, does not necessarily become weaker. It becomes leaner. And lean forces, under the right conditions, can be dangerously hard to dislodge. By the time the clouds begin to thin and the first hints of Allied air power return to the sky, German units are already aware that time is no longer on their side. The pocket they expected to crush quickly has hardened into a knot of resistance that refuses to unravel. What was meant to be a step in a grand offensive has become an anchor, heavy, immovable, and increasingly costly. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the change is subtle but profound. They are no longer reacting to events, they are shaping them. And in doing so, they force German veterans to confront a reality they did not expect to face in the Ardennes, an American infantry that has learned how to fight without its crutches, and learned it fast.
The sky begins to change first. For days,
Thick clouds have sealed Bastogne inside a gray lid, denying the Americans their greatest advantage. No aircraft, no resupply drops, no reconnaissance from above. The weather has been the Germans' silent ally, reinforcing the encirclement more effectively than any unit on the ground. Then, slowly, the ceiling lifts. On the morning of December 23rd, breaks appear in the cloud cover, thin at first, then wider. Sunlight touches the snow in pale streaks, and for the first time in a week, men inside the Bastogne perimeter dare to look up with something other than resignation. German veterans understand immediately what this means. The American system, which seemed absent, is not gone, only delayed. Within hours, the sound returns. Not artillery, not engines on the ground, engines in the air. Allied transport planes begin to appear, small against the winter sky, but unmistakable. Parachutes bloom open, white and colored canopies drifting down toward frozen fields and shattered clearings. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Not enough to end the siege, but enough to ensure it will not end on German terms. For the defenders, the effect is electric. Hunger remains, cold remains, casualties remain, but the psychological equation changes. Survival is no longer an act of blind defiance. It becomes a calculation again, one that finally favors the men in the foxholes. German artillery intensifies, trying to disrupt the drops. Some supplies fall into enemy hands, others shatter on impact, but enough reach the lines to stabilize the defense. Machine guns regain sustained fire, mortars resume regular patterns, medics work with slightly less desperation. The perimeter tightens. For German units already stretched thin by fuel shortages and mounting losses elsewhere in the Ardennes, the realization sets in. Bastogne is no longer simply holding, it is actively denying momentum. Every day the town remains in American hands, disrupts German schedules, delays movements, and forces reallocations of scarce resources. And still, assaults continue. German infantry pushes forward through forests and across open ground, sometimes supported by armor, sometimes alone. They encounter the same resistance, disciplined fire, rapid counterattacks, positions reoccupied almost as soon as they are lost. Even when penetrations occur, they are shallow and temporary. What frustrates German veterans most is the consistency. This is not a defense driven by fear of punishment or blind obedience. It is driven by a shared understanding at every level. Bastogne must hold, and therefore it will. Orders reinforce it, but belief sustains it. Inside the American lines, the rhythm of combat settles into a grim routine. Short bursts of violence followed by long stretches of waiting. Men sleep when they can, eat when they can, and fight when they must. Friendships compress under pressure. Losses are absorbed quietly. Grief is postponed. The longer the siege lasts, the clearer the transformation becomes. These are no longer paratroopers defined by how they arrived on the battlefield. They are infantrymen defined by how they stay. German reports increasingly reflect this shift. References to airborne elements give way to descriptions of stubborn American defensive groups and well-coordinated resistance. The language loses its early confidence. The expectation of collapse disappears from official tone. This matters. War is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with assumptions, and at Bastogne, German assumptions about American infantry are failing under observation. When relief finally approaches from the south, armored elements pushing through the Ardennes under relentless pressure, German commanders already understand the implications. Even if the pocket is reduced later, the cost has been disproportionate. Time has been lost, initiative has slipped, the siege has become a liability. For the men of the 101st, relief does not arrive as a moment of celebration, it arrives as confirmation. Confirmation that what they endured mattered, that the frozen nights, the rationed bullets, the decisions made in darkness were not wasted acts of endurance. They did not hold because help was guaranteed. Help came because they held.
This distinction matters deeply to German veterans analyzing the battle after the fact. Bastogne was not saved by armor alone. It was preserved by infantry that refused to behave according to expectations, infantry that made itself expensive to defeat. As the encirclement loosens and the front begins to stabilize, the reputation of the 101st Airborne shifts permanently, not as paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, but as ground fighters capable of absorbing pressure that would break less cohesive units. Bastogne becomes a reference point, not for heroics, not for slogans, but for something more unsettling to those who faced them, an American infantry that could endure isolation, deprivation, and uncertainty, and still function as a coherent, aggressive force. For German veterans, that lesson lingers long after the snow melts. Because once an enemy proves it can survive without its advantages, it becomes far harder to predict and far harder to defeat.
As the encirclement loosens, Bastogne does not immediately become quiet. German units withdraw in stages, covering their movements with artillery and rearguard actions. The pressure eases, but the danger remains constant. Mines litter the roads, snipers stay behind. Every tree line still demands caution. For the men of the 101st Airborne, survival does not suddenly feel safer, it simply feels less desperate. Yet something has already changed. Bastogne is no longer just a town on a map. It has become a symbol, both inside Allied command rooms and within German after-action discussions. What began as an operational necessity, holding a road hub, has evolved into a psychological event that reshapes expectations on both sides. For German veterans, this is the uncomfortable part. They did not lose Bastogne because of a single decisive blow. They were not overwhelmed by superior numbers in the early phase. They did not face a sudden technological advantage. What they encountered instead was an American infantry unit that absorbed punishment, adapted under isolation, and refused to behave as predicted. That kind of enemy forces re-evaluation. German commanders reviewing the Ardennes offensive begin to acknowledge that certain American units can no longer be categorized as predictable or fragile once cut off. The 101st Airborne becomes an example cited not for its equipment, but for its behavior under pressure. The lesson is implicit. Future engagements with similar formations may require far greater cost than initially assumed. Inside the American ranks, the shift is quieter but just as real. The men of the 101st do not see themselves as symbols. They see empty foxholes where friends once stood. They see frost-bitten hands that may never fully recover. They see the faces of medics who worked without rest, of officers who never made it out of the perimeter. Victory, if it can be called that, feels heavy. But reputation travels faster than reflection. Reports circulate, correspondents arrive. Bastogne becomes shorthand for resistance. Within the U.S. Army, the defense is studied not only as a tactical episode, but as proof of what airborne infantry can do when forced into prolonged ground combat. This matters far beyond Belgium. Until this point in the war, American airborne units are still often viewed through the lens of how they enter battle: drops, gliders, surprise. Bastogne reframes that identity. It demonstrates that these soldiers are not defined by insertion alone, but sustained combat capability under the worst possible conditions. For German veterans, that realization lands late but clearly. The Americans at Bastogne did not wait for rescue before deciding how to fight. They did not collapse when deprived of comfort, supply, or certainty. Instead, they compressed, they simplified, they focused on fundamentals, terrain, coordination, and the will to deny ground. This is dangerous because it suggests a broader truth about American infantry as the war matures. Early in the conflict, German forces often encountered U.S. units still learning their craft, reliant on doctrine and material advantage. By late 1944, that learning curve has shortened dramatically.
Units like the 101st arrive already adapted and adapt further under fire. Bastogne accelerates this evolution. German veterans begin to notice a pattern forming across the Western Front. American infantry no longer disengages as easily once committed. Counterattacks come faster. Defensive positions recover quicker. Command cohesion survives disruption. The behaviors observed at Bastogne are not isolated anomalies, they are signals. For the men who held the perimeter, this realization is abstract. They move on to new positions, new orders, new dangers. The war does not pause to commemorate endurance, it demands more of it. Yet Bastogne follows them, in training notes, in briefings, in the way future operations account for American resistance. What the Germans feared was not the town itself, it was the precedent. If one airborne division could hold under those conditions, what else might American infantry units endure elsewhere? What assumptions could no longer be trusted? What calculations had to change? By early 1945, as the Ardennes offensive collapses and Allied momentum rebuilds, Bastogne stands as a quiet pivot point, not a victory that ends the war, but one that reshapes how it is fought in the West. For German veterans looking back, the memory is not of dramatic charges or cinematic moments. It is of foxholes that stayed occupied, lines that refused to thin, an enemy that did not behave as theory suggested it should. And that memory lingers longer than fear of bombs or tanks. Because weapons can be counted, but resolve cannot.
Long after the snow melted and the Ardennes returned to quiet forests and villages, Bastogne continued to exist, not on maps, but in memory. For German veterans who survived the winter of 1944-45, the town became a reference point in conversations, reports, and later recollections. Not because it marked a decisive defeat by itself, but because it forced an adjustment in how the enemy was understood. Bastogne contradicted expectations that had guided German planning for years. Before the Ardennes, American infantry was often described in German doctrine with a familiar set of assumptions: strong logistics, heavy reliance on firepower, limited tolerance for prolonged isolation, dangerous when supported, vulnerable when cut off. Bastogne dismantled that framework. What German units encountered was an American formation that did not disintegrate under pressure, but reorganized internally. Leadership did not evaporate when senior officers were lost. Discipline did not degrade when rations vanished. Morale did not collapse simply because conditions were brutal. From a professional military standpoint, this was troubling. German veterans understood what they were seeing. This was not fanaticism. It was not blind obedience. It was something more stable and harder to counter. A culture of small unit responsibility, reinforced by training and experience, that allowed soldiers to function when higher systems failed. The 101st Airborne was not unique in courage. German forces had faced courageous enemies before. What set Bastogne apart was consistency. The defense did not depend on a few exceptional moments or individuals. It depended on repetition. Position held, position regained, position adjusted, again and again. This forced German commanders to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. American infantry had matured faster than anticipated. Early encounters in North Africa and Italy had allowed German officers to believe that American forces could be outmaneuvered through experience and pressure. By late 1944, that gap had narrowed dramatically. Bastogne showed that some American units had internalized the lessons of the war and could apply them instinctively under extreme stress. That realization carried consequences. As Allied operations resumed after the Ardennes, German units became more cautious when facing American infantry formations known for cohesion. Assault plans became more conservative, timelines extended.
Expectations of rapid breakthroughs diminished. Fear does not always announce itself as panic. Sometimes it appears as hesitation. For the men of the 101st, this shift was invisible. They did not see German planning tables or after-action assessments. They saw only the immediate aftermath, the cost paid in bodies, the exhaustion etched into faces, the quiet recalibration of what survival meant. Many would later struggle to explain Bastogne to those who had not been there. Maps made it look simple. Arrows and circles suggested clarity, but inside the perimeter, rarely clarity existed. There was only cold, confusion, and the next task that needed doing. Decisions were made in seconds that would be analyzed for decades. The Germans, however, did analyze them. In hindsight, Bastogne became an example used to explain why the Western Front no longer behaved as expected in 1945. Why American infantry could hold ground without armor. Why encirclement did not always equal collapse. Why Allied advances regained momentum so quickly after temporary setbacks. It was not that American soldiers were suddenly different people. It was that they had become different soldiers. And Bastogne was one of the places where that transformation became impossible to ignore. For German veterans, the memory carried a particular edge. They had done many things correctly at Bastogne. The encirclement was real, the pressure was intense, the conditions favored the attacker, and still the outcome refused to align with experience. That is the kind of battle professionals remember, not because it flatters them, but because it forces them to question what they thought they understood. The 101st Airborne did not win Bastogne by annihilating the enemy. They won it by denying the enemy the result they needed: time, momentum, predictability. In war, denying the enemy certainty can be as powerful as destroying his forces. By the time Allied offensives rolled eastward in early 1945, Bastogne had already done its work. The Ardennes gamble had failed, the Western Front stabilized, and German units now faced an opponent they could no longer comfortably categorize. An American infantry that could endure isolation, an American infantry that could adapt under deprivation, an American infantry that did not require perfect conditions to function. For those who had once dismissed such a possibility, the lesson was already written, not in theory, but in frozen ground around a small Belgian town. And lessons learned that way are rarely forgotten. When the fighting moved east and the Ardennes faded from daily headlines, Bastogne did not fade from memory. For Allied commanders, it became a case study. For American infantry, a reference point. And for German veterans, a cautionary example, one that quietly altered how future encounters with U.S. forces were approached. The most significant impact of Bastogne was not territorial, it was psychological. Before the winter of 1944, German forces often framed American units in operational terms: firepower, logistics, air superiority. The Americans were dangerous because of what supported them. Remove the support and the danger diminished. Bastogne shattered that logic. After Bastogne, German planning could no longer rely on the assumption that American infantry would unravel once isolated. That change mattered enormously in a war already slipping out of reach. As Allied armies resumed their advance into Germany, German units faced increasing pressure with fewer resources. Fuel shortages worsened. Replacement troops were younger, less trained. Command structures strained under constant retreat. In that environment, assumptions were everything. If the enemy could be expected to pause, withdraw, or reorganize slowly, precious time could be gained. But Bastogne suggested otherwise. The Americans would hold. They would adapt. They would counterattack. For German veterans who had faced British methodical advances and Soviet mass assaults, the emerging American profile was unsettling. It combined flexibility with aggression and endurance with coordination. Not flawless, but increasingly resilient. The men of the 101st Airborne did not witness this shift directly. They were too busy surviving the aftermath, reinforcing positions, and preparing for new operations. Bastogne did not grant them immunity from loss. It simply proved that loss did not automatically translate into failure. For many soldiers, the realization came later. They noticed how other units reacted when they mentioned Bastogne, how officers referenced it during briefings, how replacements listened differently when veterans spoke about holding ground without supply. The name carried weight, not as myth, but as experience. German veterans felt that weight too. In later reflections, Bastogne appears not as a dramatic defeat, but as a warning, a moment when the enemy's learning curve became undeniable. The Americas were no longer novices refining doctrine under fire. They were practitioners, capable of absorbing shock and continuing to function. That realization shaped fear in a quiet way. Not the fear of overwhelming force, but the fear of an opponent who refuses to behave as expected. War rewards prediction, it punishes surprise. Bastogne reversed that equation. What German forces encountered there was not simply courage, but consistency. The defense did not depend on singular acts of heroism. It depended on hundreds of small decisions made correctly under extreme stress. That kind of performance is difficult to defeat because it offers no obvious point of failure. The result was a subtle erosion of confidence. Not in victory, that had already become unlikely, but in control. Control over tempo, control over pressure, control over outcomes. After Bastogne, German units could still fight effectively. They could still inflict casualties. But the belief that American infantry would eventually behave normally under isolation was gone. That belief mattered more than it seemed. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pressed deeper into Germany, the war increasingly became a series of delays rather than defenses. Every hour bought mattered. Every assumption tested carried risk. Bastogne had already demonstrated which assumptions were unsafe. For the men who held the perimeter, the legacy was quieter. They carried Bastogne with them not as a story to tell, but as a standard, a benchmark of what they knew they could endure, and therefore what they could never again pretend was impossible. And that may have been the most enduring outcome of all, because an infantry that knows it can hold under the worst conditions becomes harder to intimidate in any condition. For German veterans, Bastogne marked the moment when the American soldier stopped being evaluated primarily by his equipment and started being measured by his resolve. And resolve, once proven, does not need to announce itself again. It simply waits.
When the war in Europe finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, Bastogne was already fading from daily reports. New battles, new advances, new cities liberated. The front moved fast, and history rarely waits for reflection. But Bastogne did not disappear. It stayed alive in how the war was remembered and in how it was understood. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne was never a slogan. It was not a line in a speech or a clean victory captured in a single photograph. It was hunger that lasted too long, cold that never fully left the bones, faces that did not return to the perimeter, decisions made in silence without certainty of reward. They did not hold Bastogne because history demanded it. They held it because letting go was no longer an option they allowed themselves to consider. That distinction is important. German veterans who studied the battle later did not describe Bastogne as a failure of planning or courage on their side. Many of them fought exactly as they had been trained to fight. They applied pressure. They exploited weather. They completed the encirclement. On paper, the logic was sound. What failed was the assumption.
The assumption that American infantry, once stripped of its advantages, would behave predictably, that it would calculate risk, weigh losses, and eventually withdraw when isolation became unbearable. Bastogne rejected that script. What the Germans encountered was not an army fueled by abundance, but one operating on resolve. A force that simplified under pressure instead of fragmenting, that delegated responsibility downward instead of waiting for perfect orders, that fought not because success was guaranteed, but because surrender was mentally removed from the equation. That kind of enemy is difficult to intimidate, not because it is reckless, but because it has already accepted the cost. In that sense, Bastogne was not an exception. It was a signal that the American army, by late 1944, had crossed a threshold. It was no longer learning how to fight a modern war. It was learning how to endure one. And endurance, once proven, reshapes every future engagement. The 101st Airborne did not win the war at Bastogne, but they proved something that mattered just as much. They proved that American infantry could be isolated, undersupplied, surrounded, and still function as a coherent, aggressive force. They proved that discipline did not vanish with comfort, that leadership did not evaporate with chaos, that cohesion could survive even when certainty did not. For German veterans, that lesson lingered, because weapons can be measured, numbers can be counted, logistics can be disrupted. But once resolve is demonstrated, it becomes a variable no plan can safely ignore. That is why Bastogne still matters. Not as legend, not as propaganda, but as a reminder that wars are ultimately decided not only by resources, but by what soldiers believe they can endure and still stand.